Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Kayla and I release new videos every Monday about all things BPD. So if that sounds good to you, be sure to hit the subscribe button down below as well as the bell notification up top. Now today, by popular demand, we are going to be talking about hypersexuality in relation to BPD. If you're familiar with some of the characteristics or symptoms of BPD, you know that impulsivity is one of them. And so impulsivity means things like risky behaviors, and sexual risky behaviors often falls in that category. So it makes sense that there's an overlap between the two, and if you're curious to find out more, let's get into it. So what is hypersexuality? Hypersexuality can be understood as compulsive sexual behavior. So it's essentially being addicted to fantasies, urges, or behaviors. Now this is different than having a higher sex drive. It's not because you have a higher sex drive that you encounter hypersexuality. Hypersexuality, it's really this extreme of continuously engaging in sexual behaviors, oftentimes that are risky and unhealthy for yourself. And hypersexuality can develop for a whole range of reasons. So things like early childhood trauma, being the victim of sexual abuse growing up, traumatic events, abandonment. I know for myself, while I wouldn't categorize myself who experienced this specific thing or hypersexuality per se, but I definitely experienced urges of wanting attention desperately from people, not in a sexual way, because I wouldn't necessarily go through with those things, but it was more of just wanting attention from men in general, to feed this kind of craving because I was so scared of being abandoned. Then getting this constant reassurance and revalidation from others made me feel good. And so we can translate this to then people who experience hypersexuality, who suffered abandonment growing up. They're trying to fill this void within them by this sleeping with multiple partners, multiple people, never feeling satisfied until they do, afterwards feeling guilt and shame, but at the same time being consumed by fantasies and urges and behaviors that they have a really hard time controlling. What's interesting with all this is that it's estimated that about 90% of people who struggle with some sort of sexual addiction, sexually intense behaviors, actually do meet the criteria for a personality disorder. We could see this making sense, for example, if we look at dependent personality disorder. People who are extremely dependent, extremely insecure, there is an overlap here with hypersexuality, because there is this innate dependency and need to be loved by others, and this translates easily through sex. With BPD, we see this more as the risky behavior taking actions, the impulsivity that we see mixed in with this hypersexuality. So the impulse control, maybe it isn't there or is lacking, and so we engage in these behaviors paired with this fear of abandonment and these feelings of feeling inadequate and not good enough, where sex becomes this thing that just makes sense. It is accessible to some of us, and you can, whatever, I'm not going to go into that, but essentially it's something that's accessible that fills that gap of needing to feel loved and wanted while also engaging in risky and impulsive behaviors, which scratches that itch as well. Okay, so now that we understand what hypersexuality is, the relation to hypersexuality and personality disorders, specifically BPD, I want to kind of turn the page and talk about masochism, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, and BPD. Okay, so we talked about impulsivity being one of the core symptoms. Something else that most people who have BPD engage in is self-harm. Self-harm, when we think about this, classically speaking, we think of cutting, burning, doing other things physically to our bodies, but the classic ones, it's really the cutting that people think about self-harm. Self-harm can also look like eating excessively, right? The binge eating kind of falls into that. It's a way of punishing ourselves. Sexual masochism also falls in this category. People don't think about it that way, but this is a form of self-harm. It's a form of impulse control issues. It's also a form of something that stems from this fear of abandonment. And so this is why this category of hypersexuality, sexuality in general, can become dark very easily for those who have BPD. And so what we see sometimes, and for folks who do have BPD, is that they engage in not only risky sexual behaviors, but also sexual behaviors that are a bit more extreme on the spectrum. So doing things that would potentially inflict harm upon themselves, whether emotional or physical. They might have more of a tendency to have more out there sexual fantasies and require more of those things from their partners. And so this is kind of a realm that we do see falling into this umbrella of hypersexuality. This applies to you, then you can relate to what I'm talking about. It's this feeling of not feeling satisfied unless we're using ourselves essentially to derive pleasure from others, and it becomes this weird form of punishing yourself during sex, using yourself as an object, objectifying yourself, and it's all tangled up in this core feeling of being unworthy and unlovable and always needing to do more and harm ourselves to maintain love and admiration from others. So if you're struggling with hypersexuality or sexual masochism, what do you do? How can you help with those things? The first thing I would recommend is to limit your triggers, which firstly requires you to know what your triggers are. But essentially, there are things that are probably relatable to a lot of you, things like drinking, going out. So when we're impaired, so whether you're drinking, you're doing drugs or a substance of some sort, this impairs your capacity to reason, to think, to make effective and healthy choices for yourself. And so if you know that drinking or doing other substances is a trigger for you, meaning that usually when that happens, you end up sleeping with someone or putting yourself at risk, then we know this. We can limit the drinking. I know it's difficult because if you're in your 20s, depending how old you are, drinking in general is such a part of the culture, and when you don't, people tend to feel weird around you and might say things like, oh, come on, it's fine, just like have a drink, why aren't you drinking? People feel the need to comment about those things. And so it's about exposing yourself to situations where typically you would drink, deciding not to, or lowering the amount that you would if you're also someone who has impulse control issues and you're not able to limit yourself. Maybe at first you go cold turkey for a bit, you see how that feels, just to reduce the risk of not engaging in these risky patterns and these unhealthy things that you have been doing your entire life. The second thing I would recommend is to join support groups. Just like there's support groups for AA, there's also support groups for people who deal with sexual addictions. Those can be very healing, very helpful to surround yourself in people who understand your struggle. And the last thing, of course, is that you can do your own work by consulting books, podcasts, YouTube videos such as this one, or consulting a licensed professional, therapist, counselor, life coach, whatever that looks like for you, so you can have someone who caters to your specific needs and who can follow you step by step throughout this recovery journey. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me today. I wish you all an awesome rest of your week, and I will see you next Monday for another episode of On the Line.